The service bay at Patterson's Auto Repair in rural Georgia smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and the fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows on the concrete floor where Thomas Washington stood waiting for the diagnosis on his 2008 Ford F-150. He was 68 years old, black, and dressed in the casual clothes of a retired man running Saturday errands, his grey hair trimmed neat, and his posture still straight despite decades of physical labor. The truck had developed a rough idle that morning, a symptom Thomas recognized immediately from 40 years of working as a master mechanic, but he had come to Patterson's because his own garage was being renovated and his tools were packed away, and because the problem seemed minor enough that paying for a quick fix was easier than unpacking everything. Kyle Patterson, the shop owner, was 34 years old, white, and had taken over the business from his father 3 years earlier. He emerged from the service bay, wiping his hands on a red shop rag, his expression set in what Thomas recognized as the face mechanics made when they were about to deliver expensive news to customers they assumed knew nothing about cars. "Well, Mr. Washington, I've got some bad news. Your fuel injection system is completely shot. The injectors are clogged, the fuel pump is failing, and honestly, at the mileage on this truck, you're probably looking at needing a full system replacement. Parts and labor I'd estimate around $3,200, maybe more depending on what else we find once we get in there." Thomas looked at Kyle for a long moment, processing the diagnosis that bore no relationship to the actual problem with his truck. A rough idle on a 2008 F-150, with the symptoms he'd observed, was almost certainly a dirty throttle body or a faulty idle air control valve, both issues that could be diagnosed in minutes and fixed for less than $100 in parts plus minimal labor. What Kyle was describing would produce completely different symptoms and would be obvious from a basic diagnostic scan. "You ran a diagnostic?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Don't need to. I've been doing this 15 years. I can tell from how the engine sounds and from looking at the fuel pressure readings. This is a common problem with these older Ford trucks. You let the maintenance slide, and eventually the whole fuel system goes." The assumption that Thomas had neglected maintenance was predictable, was part of the pattern Thomas had observed throughout his life of white service providers, assuming that black customers were ignorant or irresponsible or both. The actual maintenance records for the truck were meticulous, documented every oil change and filter replacement, and fluid check Thomas had performed himself since buying the vehicle new in 2008. But Kyle had looked at Thomas and seen an elderly black man and had made assumptions about what he knew and what he could be convinced to pay for. "That seems expensive for what I'm hearing," Thomas said carefully. "Could it be something simpler? Maybe the throttle body or the idle control valve?" Kyle's expression shifted slightly, a flash of irritation at having his diagnosis questioned. "Those would be the first things I'd check if it was a simple issue, but I'm telling you, this is deeper than that. You can get a second opinion if you want, but any honest mechanic is going to tell you the same thing, and the longer you wait, the worse it's going to get. You could end up stranded on the side of the road." It was a sales technique Thomas had seen countless times, creating urgency and fear to pressure customers into authorizing expensive repairs. And it worked on many people, particularly those who genuinely knew nothing about automotive systems and who trusted that mechanics were being honest about necessary work. But Thomas knew exactly what was wrong with his truck, knew that Kyle's diagnosis was either incompetent or deliberately fraudulent, and he felt the familiar anger rising that came from being treated as stupid or gullible because of his race and his age. "I'll think about it," Thomas said. "How much do I owe you for the diagnostic?" $75. "But if you authorize the repair, I'll waive the diagnostic fee." Thomas paid the $75 in cash, declined to authorize any repair work, and drove his truck out of Patterson's Auto Repair with the same rough idle it had arrived with. He drove directly to the auto zone 3 miles down the highway, purchased a can of throttle body cleaner for $8 and a new idle air control valve for $42, and then drove to his daughter Michelle's house, where she lived with her husband and 2 teenage sons. Michelle was in the front yard working in her garden when Thomas pulled into the driveway, and she straightened up when she saw him, pulling off her gardening gloves. "Hey, Dad, thought you were getting the truck fixed today. Changed my mind. Can I borrow your driveway for about 20 minutes? I need to fix something and my garage is still torn up from the renovation." "Of course. Everything okay?" Thomas told her about Kyle Patterson's diagnosis and his quote for $3,200, and Michelle's expression darkened with the same anger Thomas had felt. She had grown up watching her father work on cars, had learned to change oil and replace brake pads and diagnose problems, had inherited his mechanical aptitude, along with his understanding of how often black people were treated as marks by service providers who assumed ignorance. "Are you going to report him? That's fraud, Dad. He tried to charge you for repairs you don't need. I'm thinking about what to do. First, I'm going to fix my truck and document it. Then I'll decide." Thomas opened the hood of the F-150, located the throttle body, and spent 12 minutes cleaning the carbon buildup that had been restricting airflow and causing the rough idle. Then he spent another 8 minutes replacing the idle air control valve, a straightforward procedure that required removing 2 bolts and disconnecting 1 electrical connector. When he started the truck again, the idle was smooth, the rough running had disappeared completely, and the engine ran exactly as it should. Michelle had been recording the repair on her phone, capturing Thomas's methodical work and the clear improvement in how the engine ran afterward. She also photographed the receipt from AutoZone, showing the $50 in parts Thomas had purchased, and she photographed the receipt from Patterson's Auto Repair, showing the $75 diagnostic fee and the quote for $3,200 in unnecessary repairs. "You should post this online," Michelle said. "People need to know that Patterson's is ripping off customers. And they especially need to know that he was trying to rip off someone who actually knows more about cars than he does." Thomas was hesitant about public exposure, had spent most of his life avoiding confrontation and keeping his head down and navigating racism through careful diplomacy rather than direct challenge. But he also thought about all the other customers Kyle Patterson had probably overcharged, particularly elderly customers and women and people of color who were perceived as easy targets, people who did not have Thomas's expertise to recognize fraudulent diagnoses and who paid for repairs they did not need because they trusted that mechanics were being honest. "Let me think about it," Thomas said again, and Michelle nodded but kept the video and the photos, knowing that her father's thinking about something usually meant he would eventually decide to act, but needed time to process the decision. Thomas drove home with his truck running smoothly, the rough idle eliminated by $50 in parts and 20 minutes of straightforward work that any competent mechanic should have diagnosed correctly. He thought about Kyle Patterson's diagnosis, about the assumption that Thomas would simply accept the word of a white mechanic without question, about the casualness with which Kyle had tried to extract $3,200 for unnecessary repairs. The fraud was blatant, would be obvious to any mechanic who actually examined the truck properly, but it depended on customers not having the expertise to recognize the fraud. And that was the mechanism through which so much exploitation operated, through information, asymmetry, and trust, and the assumptions that certain people could be deceived because they came from communities that were systematically denied access to technical education and economic resources. If you are reading this account and recognizing something familiar in the dynamics of how Thomas was treated, in the assumptions about competence that Kyle made based on Thomas's race and age, in the casual extraction attempted because the mechanic believed his customer would not know any better, consider how these patterns extend beyond automotive repair into countless service interactions. The work of ensuring these stories reach wider audiences creates accountability that individual complaints cannot achieve alone. Thomas had grown up in rural Georgia in the 1950s and 60s, had learned about cars from his father, who worked as a sharecropper, but who maintained vehicles for the white families who owned the land. His father had taught him that mechanical knowledge was a form of power, that being able to fix things made you valuable and gave you leverage and opportunities that formal education might not provide to black men in the segregated South. Thomas had absorbed those lessons, had developed his skills through observation and practice, and eventually through technical training after high school, and had worked as a mechanic for 40 years before retiring 5 years ago. He had worked at dealerships and independent shops and had eventually opened his own garage, building a reputation for honest work and fair pricing and expertise that attracted customers across racial lines. He had trained younger mechanics, had advocated for technical education in black communities, had believed that demonstrating competence and professionalism would gradually erode racist assumptions about black people's capabilities. And to some extent it had worked. had earned him respect and financial stability and the comfortable retirement he now enjoyed. But incidents like the one at Patterson's Auto Repair revealed the limits of individual achievement in changing systemic patterns, revealed that no matter how much expertise Thomas had accumulated or how much respect he had earned, he could still be treated as an ignorant mark by a white mechanic who saw only race and age and assumed vulnerability. The incident was both personal affront and illustration of broader dynamics, and Thomas struggled with how to respond in ways that would address both dimensions. He called his son-in-law, Marcus, who was a lawyer specializing in consumer protection, and described what had happened at Patterson's. Marcus listened carefully, asking clarifying questions about the diagnosis and the quote, and what Thomas had observed about Kyle Patterson's demeanor and statements. "That's textbook fraud," Marcus said when Thomas finished. "He provided a false diagnosis, recommended unnecessary repairs, and attempted to charge you thousands of dollars for work that wasn't needed. You could file a complaint with the Georgia Governor's Office of Consumer Protection, you could report him to the Better Business Bureau, or you could consider a civil suit for attempted fraud. Do you have documentation? Michelle recorded me fixing the truck. We have the receipts from AutoZone and from Patterson's showing what I paid for parts versus what he tried to charge. And I have 40 years of experience as a certified master mechanic to testify that his diagnosis was wrong. That's strong evidence. The question is, what outcome you want? Do you want him shut down? Do you want compensation for the diagnostic fee and your time? Do you want public accountability so other potential victims know to avoid his shop?" Thomas thought about the question, about what justice would look like in this situation, about whether punishing Kyle Patterson was sufficient or whether something broader was needed. "I want people to know what he did. I want other mechanics to understand that they can't just assume black customers don't know anything about cars. And I want Kyle Patterson to face some consequences. But I'm not trying to destroy his business. I'm trying to make sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." Then I'd suggest starting with a formal complaint to the Consumer Protection Office and to the Better Business Bureau, along with posting Michelle's video online so potential customers can see what happened. If Patterson responds defensively, or if the official complaints don't produce results, we can escalate to legal action. But often, public exposure and official complaints are enough to change behavior, especially if the evidence is clear. Thomas agreed to that approach, and over the following days he filed the complaints and Michelle posted the video to Facebook and to a local community group focused on consumer advocacy. The video was straightforward, showed Thomas explaining what Kyle Patterson had diagnosed, showed the quote for $3,200, showed Thomas fixing the truck himself in 20 minutes with $50 in parts, and showed the truck running smoothly afterward. Michelle had titled it, "Master Mechanic Exposes Fraudulent Repair Quote," and had included all the relevant details about Patterson's Auto Repair's location and the date of the incident. The video spread quickly, was shared by hundreds of people within the first 48 hours, was picked up by local news outlets who contacted Thomas for interviews. The story had elements that made it compelling beyond just consumer fraud. The elderly black grandfather, the white mechanic who tried to overcharge him, the reveal that Thomas was actually an expert who knew exactly what was wrong with his truck, the dramatic difference between the fraudulent quote and the actual cost of repair. Thomas gave interviews to 2 local television stations and to the local newspaper, and in each interview he was careful to frame the incident not just as individual fraud, but as illustrative of broader patterns. He talked about how automotive repair shops often targeted vulnerable customers, how women and elderly people, and people of color, were frequently overcharged or sold unnecessary services, how the industry relied on information asymmetry and trust, and how that trust was often exploited for profit. And he talked about his own background, about 40 years as a mechanic, about the assumptions that Kyle Patterson had made about his competence based on his appearance, about how racism operated through these kinds of everyday interactions where black people were assumed to be less knowledgeable or less capable, or easier to deceive. The interviews were thoughtful and nuanced, avoided reducing the incident to simple heroes and villains, while still being clear about what had happened and why it mattered. The response was intense and divided. Many people, particularly in black communities and among consumer advocates, praised Thomas for speaking out, shared their own stories of being overcharged by mechanics or other service providers, and called for accountability for Patterson's auto repair. Some people organized a boycott, urging community members to avoid the shop and to share information about reliable and honest mechanics. And several other customers of Patterson's came forward with their own stories of questionable diagnoses and expensive repairs that seemed unnecessary in retrospect. But there was also backlash, particularly from some white community members who defended Kyle Patterson, who suggested that Thomas was making race an issue when it was just a business dispute, who argued that mistakes happen and that accusing Patterson of fraud was excessive. Some of the backlash took the form of attacking Thomas's credibility, questioning whether he really was a master mechanic or whether the repair he performed had actually fixed the problem or whether he was exaggerating the difference between Patterson's quote and the actual repair cost. Kyle Patterson himself responded through a Facebook post on the shop's business page, claiming that Thomas had misunderstood the diagnosis, that the quote had included other recommended maintenance that Thomas was choosing to ignore, and that he stood by the quality of work performed at Patterson's auto repair. The post did not address the specific claims about the fraudulent diagnosis, did not explain why he had quoted $3,200 for fuel system replacement when the actual problem was a $50 fix, and read more like defensive damage control than genuine accountability. The Georgia Governor's Office of Consumer Protection opened an investigation into Patterson's auto repair, based on Thomas's complaint, and the additional complaints that had been filed by other customers after the video went viral. The investigation would involve reviewing Patterson's records, interviewing customers who had received repairs, comparing diagnoses and work performed to industry standards, and determining whether there was a pattern of fraudulent or deceptive practices. Thomas cooperated fully with the investigation, providing his documentation and his expert analysis of what had been wrong with his truck versus what Kyle Patterson had diagnosed, and offering to testify if necessary about industry standards and proper diagnostic procedures. He also connected the investigators with other mechanics in the area who were willing to review Patterson's work and provide professional opinions about whether diagnoses and repairs had been appropriate. The investigation took 4 months, during which time Patterson's auto repairs business declined significantly as customers chose to go elsewhere, spooked by the video and the news coverage and the mounting complaints. Kyle Patterson hired a lawyer, released statements claiming he was being unfairly targeted, and eventually closed the shop temporarily, citing the investigation and the loss of business as making operations unsustainable. The investigation concluded that Patterson's auto repair had engaged in deceptive practices, had provided false diagnoses to multiple customers, had recommended and charged for unnecessary repairs, and had particularly targeted elderly and female customers who were less likely to question diagnoses or to have the expertise to recognize fraud. The report documented 17 specific cases beyond Thomas's where customers had been overcharged, totaling more than $60,000 in fraudulent billing over approximately 2 years. Kyle Patterson was fined $15,000, was required to make restitution to customers who could prove they had been overcharged, and was placed on probationary status that required third-party audits of his diagnostic and billing practices if he chose to reopen the shop. His business license was not revoked, which frustrated Thomas and other consumer advocates who felt the punishment was insufficient given the scope of the fraud. But the state agency argued that first-time violations did not typically result in license revocation, and that the probationary requirements would prevent future misconduct. Kyle Patterson did not reopen Patterson's auto repair, instead taking a job at a dealership in a nearby county where his history was less well known. The shop space sat empty for 6 months before being leased to a different business, and the Patterson's auto repair signs were taken down and the building was repainted, erasing the physical evidence of the business that had operated there. Thomas felt ambivalent about the outcome, satisfied that there had been some accountability, but troubled by how easily Kyle Patterson had been able to move on with minimal consequences, while the customers he had defrauded had spent months fighting for restitution. The system had worked better than it often did, had actually investigated and found wrongdoing and imposed penalties, but the process had been slow and burdensome and had required Thomas's expertise and resources and willingness to be public, advantages that most victims of fraud did not possess. He thought about all the customers who had been overcharged over the years before his complaint, about how Patterson's had operated with impunity until someone with Thomas's specific combination of expertise and willingness to challenge had come through. How many similar shops were still operating, still targeting vulnerable customers, still getting away with fraud, because the victims did not know they were being defrauded or did not have the resources to fight back? These questions led Thomas to think about what else could be done beyond just holding one mechanic accountable, about whether there were systemic interventions that might prevent or reduce this kind of exploitation. He began researching consumer protection mechanisms in the automotive repair industry, talking to other mechanics about industry practices and ethics, and thinking about what kind of education or advocacy might help potential customers protect themselves. He discovered that while there were certification programs for mechanics and regulatory frameworks for shops, there was minimal enforcement and very limited consumer education about how to recognize fraudulent diagnoses or how to challenge questionable repair recommendations. Most people had no idea how to evaluate whether a mechanic was being honest, relied entirely on trust and reputation, and were vulnerable to exploitation if that trust was betrayed. Thomas decided to create educational content, using his expertise and his experience with Patterson's as a foundation. He started a YouTube channel called Honest Mechanic, where he posted videos explaining common car problems, demonstrating how to diagnose issues, discussing how to evaluate repair quotes, and providing guidance on what questions to ask mechanics to ensure you were getting honest service. The channel grew slowly at first, reaching mostly friends and family and people who had seen the news coverage about Patterson's. But gradually it found an audience among people who were looking for trustworthy information about car maintenance and repair, who were tired of feeling taken advantage of by mechanics, who appreciated Thomas's clear explanations and his obvious expertise and his commitment to consumer education. Within a year, Thomas had posted more than 50 videos covering topics ranging from basic maintenance to complex diagnostics, had accumulated 15,000 subscribers, and was receiving messages regularly from people thanking him for helping them avoid fraudulent repairs or for giving them the knowledge to have informed conversations with mechanics. Several people told him that his videos had helped them recognize when they were being overcharged, had given them confidence to get second opinions, had prevented them from authorizing expensive, unnecessary repairs. The channel also attracted attention from other mechanics, some supportive and appreciative of Thomas's focus on ethics and consumer education, others defensive and critical of what they saw as undermining the industry by teaching customers to be suspicious of mechanics' recommendations. Thomas responded to the criticism by emphasizing that honest mechanics should welcome informed customers, that transparency and education built rather than undermined trust, and that the industry's reputation was harmed more by fraudulent practitioners than by consumer awareness. He also used the platform to talk explicitly about race and how it affected service interactions, about how black customers and other people of color were disproportionately targeted for fraud, about how assumptions about competence and knowledge were shaped by racism, and how those assumptions enabled exploitation. These videos were more controversial, generated more pushback from viewers who wanted Thomas to keep politics out of car repair, but they also resonated deeply with viewers of color who recognized their own experiences in Thomas's descriptions. One video in particular went viral, reaching more than 1 million views, in which Thomas demonstrated how to diagnose a rough idle and explained that this was the exact problem Kyle Patterson had misdiagnosed and tried to charge him $3,200 to fix. Thomas walked viewers through the diagnostic process step by step, showed how obvious the actual problem was to anyone who knew what to look for, and discussed why Patterson's diagnosis had been either incompetent or fraudulent. The video included footage of Thomas fixing his own truck, the same footage Michelle had recorded that day in her driveway, and it showed the receipt from AutoZone for $50, in parts juxtaposed with Patterson's quote for $3,200. The contrast was stark, made the fraud undeniable, and the video generated thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences of being overcharged or misled by mechanics. The viral video brought Thomas's subscriber count to more than 100,000, transformed the channel from a small educational project into a significant platform, and created opportunities Thomas had not anticipated. He was invited to speak at consumer advocacy conferences, was interviewed by national media outlets about automotive fraud and consumer protection, and was approached by a publisher about writing a book on the topic. Thomas accepted the speaking invitations selectively, prioritizing events focused on consumer education and racial equity, and he began working on the book, envisioning it as a comprehensive guide to automotive repair from a consumer perspective, with particular attention to how vulnerable populations were targeted and how to protect yourself from fraud. The book project was ambitious, would take at least a year to complete, but Thomas had the time and the expertise and the motivation, and he felt that it could reach audiences who might not encounter his YouTube videos. If this account has illuminated something about how expertise is dismissed based on race, how service providers exploit information asymmetries, how individual acts of resistance can catalyze broader advocacy and education, consider sharing it with others who need to understand these patterns. Systemic change requires collective awareness, and stories that make abstract concepts concrete serve essential functions in building that awareness. 2 years after the incident at Patterson's Auto Repair, Thomas was 70 years old, had published his book The Honest Mechanic's Guide Protecting Yourself from Automotive Fraud, had grown his YouTube channel to 300,000 subscribers, and had become a recognized voice in consumer protection advocacy focused on automotive services. The work had become a second career, unpaid but meaningful, using his expertise and his experience to help others avoid the exploitation he had nearly experienced. He still thought about that Saturday morning at Patterson's, about the moment when Kyle Patterson had quoted him $3,200 for repairs that cost $50, about the assumptions that had enabled Kyle to believe he could get away with such blatant fraud. The incident had been transformative, not because it was unique, but because Thomas had chosen to make it public, to use it as catalyst for education and advocacy, to refuse to let it be simply a private injustice resolved quietly. And Thomas understood that his ability to make those choices, to speak out without fear of retaliation, to build a platform and write a book and become an advocate, depended on privileges that many people did not share. He was retired with financial security, had professional credentials that gave him credibility, had family support and technical resources. Many people who experienced similar fraud did not have those advantages, could not afford to fight back, could not risk the time and energy required to pursue accountability. The work Thomas was doing through his YouTube channel and his book and his advocacy was partly about helping those people, about providing education and resources that might help them protect themselves even if they could not challenge fraud directly. But he was also aware that individual consumer education was insufficient without stronger regulatory enforcement, without industry reforms that made fraud harder to commit and easier to detect, without cultural changes that addressed the racist assumptions that made certain customers targets for exploitation. He began working with consumer protection organizations to advocate for policy changes, supporting legislation that would strengthen oversight of automotive repair shops, that would require clearer documentation and customer authorization for repairs, that would make it easier to file complaints and pursue restitution. The advocacy was slow, involved navigating political processes and industry lobbying and the resistance of trade associations that viewed regulation as burdensome. But Thomas persisted, leveraging his platform and his expertise and his story to build support for reform, testifying at legislative hearings, writing op-eds, connecting with other advocates working on consumer protection issues, and gradually, incrementally, changes began happening. Georgia passed stronger consumer protection requirements for automotive repair shops, including mandatory written estimates and customer authorization before work could begin, clearer disclosure requirements, and easier complaint processes. The changes were modest, would not eliminate fraud entirely, but they shifted the baseline expectations for how shops operated and gave consumers more tools to challenge questionable charges. And the changes had been influenced by Thomas's advocacy, by the visibility his story had created, by the documentation of fraud at Patterson's that had made abstract policy debates concrete and urgent. Thomas also mentored younger mechanics, particularly young black mechanics, sharing not just technical knowledge but also the lessons he had learned about professionalism and ethics and the importance of building trust with customers. He talked about how the industry's reputation was shaped by practitioners like Kyle Patterson who exploited customers, about how honest mechanics suffered from that damaged reputation, about how building a career required both technical competence and ethical commitment. Several of the mechanics he mentored went on to open their own shops, implementing the principles Thomas had taught about transparent pricing and honest diagnostics, and treating all customers with respect, regardless of their apparent knowledge or resources. And some of them explicitly marketed themselves as honest alternatives to shops with questionable reputations, using their commitment to ethics as competitive advantage and contributing to slowly changing industry culture. Thomas's grandsons, now young adults, had grown up watching their grandfather's transformation from retired mechanic to consumer advocate, had learned from his example about using expertise toward justice, about refusing to accept being treated disrespectfully or defrauded, about building platforms and creating change. They asked him sometimes about that day at Patterson's, about what he had been thinking when Kyle quoted $3,200, about why he had decided to fight back rather than just fixing his truck and moving on. "I was angry," Thomas told them honestly. "Angry at being treated like I was stupid, angry at the assumption that I wouldn't know any better, angry at thinking about all the other people who had probably been ripped off the same way, and I realized that I had a choice about what to do with that anger. I could just fix my truck and forget about it, or I could use what happened to try to prevent it from happening to others. The second option was harder, required more of me, but it felt like the right thing to do." His grandson Jamal, 22 and studying engineering, nodded thoughtfully. "But you had advantages that made it possible to fight back. What about people who don't have those advantages? Are they just stuck accepting fraud? That's why the advocacy matters. That's why I'm doing the YouTube channel and the book and the policy work. Because individual expertise isn't enough. Individual fighting back isn't enough. The system has to change so that people don't need my specific advantages to get fair treatment. That's the larger project, and it's going to take a lot more than what I can do alone." Thomas continued the work into his early 70s, maintaining his YouTube channel, speaking at events, supporting policy advocacy, mentoring younger mechanics, and using the platform that had emerged from his encounter with Kyle Patterson to address broader issues of consumer protection and racial equity in service industries. The work was tiring, made more difficult by age, and by the ongoing battles with people who resisted regulation or who dismissed concerns about targeting of vulnerable customers. But Thomas also found the work energizing, felt that it gave purpose and direction to his retirement, connected him to communities and causes that mattered, allowed him to use his expertise toward ends more meaningful than just fixing individual cars. He had spent 40 years as a mechanic, had developed profound knowledge and skill, and now he was using that knowledge to help people protect themselves and to advocate for systems that treated everyone fairly regardless of their apparent vulnerability. He thought often about the differences between his career as a working mechanic and his current work as an advocate, about how the first had been focused on solving specific technical problems for individual customers, while the second was focused on addressing systemic problems that affected entire populations. Both were necessary, both required expertise and dedication, but the second felt more aligned with his values about justice and equity, felt like it addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. At 73, Thomas received an award from a national consumer protection organization, recognition for his advocacy and education work, and for the impact his story had had on automotive repair industry practices and consumer awareness. He traveled to Washington, D.C. for the ceremony, accompanied by Michelle and Marcus and his grandsons, and he gave a brief acceptance speech that summarized what he had learned over the 5 years since Kyle Patterson had tried to overcharge him. "When I walked into Patterson's auto repair that Saturday morning, I was just trying to get my truck fixed," Thomas said to the audience of consumer advocates and policymakers and journalists. "I didn't expect to become an advocate or to spend years working on these issues. But what happened that day revealed something about how systems work, about who gets targeted for exploitation, about how assumptions based on race and age and appearance shape interactions in ways that can be deeply unjust. The automotive repair industry is just one example of a broader pattern where vulnerable people are treated as marks, where information asymmetry is exploited for profit, where trust is betrayed. And while my story has a relatively happy ending, because I had expertise and resources and willingness to fight back, Most people don't have those advantages. Most people who get defrauded just pay the bill and move on, either because they don't know they've been defrauded or because fighting back seems too difficult or risky. The work we're doing in consumer protection, the policy reforms and the education and the enforcement, that work is about making sure people don't need my specific advantages to get fair treatment. It's about building systems that protect everyone, that make fraud harder to commit and easier to detect, and costly enough that practitioners choose honesty over exploitation. We've made some progress, but there's so much more to do. And I'm grateful to be part of a community of advocates who understand that consumer protection is a justice issue, that it's connected to racial equity and economic fairness and the basic dignity of being treated honestly. The speech was well received, was covered by media outlets, and reinforced Thomas's position as a credible voice on these issues. But more important to Thomas than the recognition was the continued impact of the work, the ongoing stream of messages from people who told him his videos had helped them avoid fraud, from mechanics who told him his advocacy had inspired them to prioritize ethics, from policymakers who told him his testimony had influenced legislation. The impact was real and measurable, could be quantified in consumer complaints prevented and fraudulent shops shut down and regulatory improvements implemented. But it was also diffuse and hard to measure, consisted of countless small interactions where people approached automotive repairs with more knowledge and confidence, where mechanics thought twice about recommending unnecessary work, where the culture of the industry shifted incrementally toward greater accountability. Thomas knew he would not see the full transformation he was working toward. That changing industry culture and regulatory frameworks and racist assumptions about competence was work that would extend beyond his lifetime. But he also knew that progress was cumulative, that the changes he had helped catalyze would persist and would create foundation for further changes, that the education and advocacy would continue through the people he had mentored and the systems that had been reformed. At 75, Thomas began to scale back his advocacy work, reducing the frequency of YouTube videos, being more selective about speaking engagements, focusing his energy on the projects and relationships that felt most meaningful. He was tired, felt the weight of years of physical labor and then years of intellectual and emotional labor, wanted to spend more time with family and on personal interests rather than on public advocacy. But he remained available as a resource, continued responding to messages from people seeking advice, continued supporting younger advocates who were carrying forward the work, continued using his platform when it could make a difference. And he continued to tell his story when asked, continued returning to that Saturday morning at Patterson's Auto Repair as the catalyst that had shaped his final decade. The story had become almost mythical in consumer protection circles, was referenced in articles and in legislative testimony and in training materials for mechanics as an example of why honesty and transparency mattered. But Thomas worked to keep the story grounded, to emphasize that what had happened was not exceptional, but representative, that Kyle Patterson's attempted fraud was one instance of a pattern that was widespread and systemic. He wanted people to understand that his response had been enabled by specific circumstances and resources, that celebrating his individual resistance should not distract from the need for systemic change, that the existence of one honest mechanic who fought back did not eliminate the need for stronger regulation and enforcement and cultural transformation. The work was never just about Thomas versus Kyle Patterson, was always about the structures that made Patterson's fraud possible and that made Thomas's resistance necessary. These distinctions mattered to Thomas, shaped how he told his story, and what lessons he emphasized, reflected his understanding that individual narratives could either reinforce or challenge systemic injustice, depending on how they were framed and deployed. He had been offered many opportunities to tell a simpler story, one focused on personal triumph and vindication, one that would be more emotionally satisfying and less politically challenging. But Thomas insisted on the more complex version, the one that acknowledged privilege and circumstance, and that kept focus on collective responsibility rather than individual exceptionalism. At 77, Thomas reduced his public presence further, stepping back from most advocacy work, continuing his YouTube channel, but posting less frequently, spending more time with family and on personal projects. He had earned the rest, had contributed more than most people ever would to addressing the problems he had encountered, had used his expertise and his experience toward justice in ways that had meaningful impact. But he remained alert to the ongoing patterns, still noticed when mechanics made assumptions about customers based on race or gender or age, still felt anger when he heard stories of exploitation, still believed that the work of consumer protection and racial equity required constant attention and sustained effort. Retirement from active advocacy did not mean retirement from caring about these issues or from supporting others who were working on them. The incident at Patterson's Auto Repair remained present in Thomas's mind, not as trauma, but as catalyst, as the moment that had revealed clearly what he had always known abstractly about how racism operated through service interactions, and how expertise could be simultaneously possessed and dismissed depending on observers' assumptions. The incident had been clarifying, had focused Thomas's understanding, and had motivated his subsequent years of advocacy, and he remained grateful for that clarity, even as he wished the lesson had not been necessary. He thought about Kyle Patterson sometimes, wondered whether the younger man had learned anything from the experience, whether losing his business and facing fines and public exposure had produced reflection and growth, or just resentment and defensiveness. Thomas had never spoken to Kyle after that initial encounter, had communicated only through lawyers and official channels, and he felt no particular need for direct confrontation or reconciliation. The accountability had been institutional rather than personal, and that felt appropriate given that the problem was systemic rather than individual. But Thomas did wonder about the customers Kyle went on to serve at the dealership where he had taken a job, wondered whether he treated them honestly or whether the patterns of exploitation continued in a new context where his history was less known. The system had imposed some consequences, but had not prevented Kyle from continuing to work as a mechanic, and Thomas understood that partial accountability was both better than nothing and insufficient to ensure future harm prevention. These realities could be frustrating if you focused on them, could lead to cynicism about whether change was possible or whether fighting back was worthwhile. But Thomas had learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to recognize that change was both possible and incomplete, that progress was real even when insufficient, that individual efforts mattered even when they could not solve systemic problems alone. He had done what he could with what he had used his expertise and his experience and his willingness to speak publicly toward consumer protection and racial justice, had built something meaningful from the attempted exploitation he had experienced at Patterson's Auto Repair. The work would continue through others, would evolve and adapt to changing contexts and challenges, would hopefully accumulate into the transformation that Thomas had worked toward. At 78, Thomas was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer, treatable but serious, requiring medical interventions and lifestyle changes and careful monitoring. The diagnosis was sobering, a reminder of mortality and of the limits of how much more time Thomas would have to continue any work or to see the results of advocacy efforts that were necessarily long-term. He underwent treatment, managed side effects, adjusted to the physical limitations that came with age and illness, and thought about what legacy he wanted to leave, what final contributions he wanted to make. His YouTube channel remained active, maintained now with help from one of his grandsons who managed the technical aspects, and Thomas continued recording videos when he felt well enough, sharing knowledge that had been accumulated over decades and that might otherwise be lost. He also worked on a final project, a video series specifically designed for young mechanics of color, addressing not just technical skills, but also the navigation of an industry where they would face discrimination and where their expertise would often be questioned. The series covered professionalism and ethics and building customer trust, but it also addressed racism explicitly, talked about the assumptions they would encounter and the strategies for challenging those assumptions while maintaining dignity and career sustainability. The series was personal and vulnerable in ways that Thomas's earlier content had not been, included stories from his own career, acknowledged the toll of constantly having to prove competence, discussed the complex choices about when to confront and when to navigate strategically. It was the advice Thomas wished he had received when he was starting out, the wisdom accumulated through decades of experience, and he hoped it might help younger mechanics avoid some of the challenges he had faced, or at least help them understand they were not alone in facing those challenges. The video series was released over several months as Thomas's health permitted, and it reached mechanics across the country who thanked him for the honesty and the specificity and the validation. Many of them shared their own stories of having their expertise questioned, of being passed over for promotions, of customers requesting white mechanics instead, of the constant low-level discrimination that shaped their daily work experiences. And many of them found community through the series, connected with each other, built networks of support that Thomas had not had access to when he was their age. Thomas felt satisfied by the response, felt that this final project had accomplished something important, even if its reach was limited, even if it could not eliminate the racism that young mechanics of color would continue to face. He had contributed what he could, had used his remaining energy toward helping others navigate the industry and the broader society, and that felt like a meaningful way to conclude his advocacy work. At 79, Thomas's cancer returned, more aggressive this time, and the prognosis was less optimistic. He underwent additional treatment, experienced declining health, and began the process of preparing for death, updating his will, having difficult conversations with family, making peace with what he had accomplished and what he had not. He thought about that Saturday morning at Patterson's Auto Repair one last time, about the truck, with the rough idle and the fraudulent diagnosis, and the choice he had made to fix the truck himself, and to document it, and to speak publicly about what had happened. The choice had led to years of advocacy work, had touched thousands of lives through education and policy change and mentorship, had transformed the end of Thomas's life into something more purposeful and impactful than he had expected retirement to be. But Thomas also thought about all the choices he had not made, all the times throughout his life when he had stayed silent about racism or exploitation, all the customers at his own shop who might have been treated differently if they had been white or male, all the ways he had accommodated himself to unjust systems rather than challenging them. The advocacy work of his 70s did not erase those earlier accommodations, did not make him a hero or a saint, just a flawed person who had tried in the end to use what he knew and what he had experienced toward something larger than himself. The complexity was important to Thomas, mattered more than the simplified narratives that people wanted to tell about his story. He was not an inspiration or a role model in any uncomplicated sense, was just someone who had made specific choices in specific circumstances and who had been fortunate enough that those choices had produced some positive outcomes. The lessons from his story were not about individual virtue, but about systemic patterns and collective responsibilities and the importance of using whatever privileges and resources one had toward justice. Thomas Washington died at age 79, surrounded by family, having lived a full life that had included 4 decades as a master mechanic and a decade as a consumer advocate, having transformed attempted exploitation into education and systemic change, having left behind a body of work and a community of people influenced by his expertise and his values. His YouTube channel remained active, managed by his grandson, continuing to provide honest automotive advice to people seeking to protect themselves from fraud. His book continued to sell, continued to be recommended by consumer advocates and given as gifts to new drivers, and used as reference by people navigating automotive repairs. And the policy changes he had helped advocate for continued to protect consumers in Georgia, and gradually spread to other states as advocates used Georgia's reforms as models for their own legislation. The impact was Thomas's legacy, was more significant than he had imagined possible that Saturday morning when he had driven away from Patterson's Auto Repair with a rough idle and with anger about attempted fraud. He had turned anger into action, had used expertise toward education, had refused to accept exploitation quietly, and had built something that persisted beyond his individual life. If you have followed Thomas Washington's journey from that attempted overcharge to years of advocacy, from frustrated customer to recognized consumer protection voice, and if you understand that his story illuminates patterns extending far beyond one repair shop in rural Georgia, consider what responsibilities that understanding creates. Consider sharing this account with others who need to see these patterns recognized and named. Consider how you might use whatever expertise or resources or platforms you possess toward similar ends, toward justice and equity and the protection of those most vulnerable to exploitation. The story that began with Kyle Patterson quoting $3,200 for a $50 repair had expanded across years and across communities, had reached mechanics and consumers and policymakers, had contributed to changing how an industry operated and how people thought about consumer protection and racial equity in service interactions. It was one story among thousands, was representative rather than unique, but it had been told and documented and used effectively, and that made it part of the larger project of social transformation. Thomas had played his part, had contributed what he could, had used what happened to him to help prevent similar exploitation of others. The work would continue through the people he had educated and mentored, through the policies that had been changed, through the cultural shifts he had helped catalyze, and the work would require continued effort and sustained attention and willingness to challenge systems that resisted accountability and transparency. That was the larger lesson, the one that extended beyond automotive repair to encompass all the ways that vulnerable people were targeted for exploitation, all the mechanisms through which racism and ageism and economic inequality operated, all the importance of using expertise and platform and resources toward justice rather than just toward individual advantage. Thomas had understood that lesson and had lived it in his final decade, and his example remained available to anyone willing to learn from it and to act accordingly. The work continues, as it always does, beyond individual stories and individual lifetimes, requiring each person to make choices about how to respond when they encounter injustice or exploitation or the targeting of vulnerable people. Thomas made his choices, used what happened at Patterson's Auto Repair as catalyst for change, refused to accept being treated as ignorant or easy to deceive, and built something meaningful from his anger and his expertise. Others will make their own choices, in their own contexts, facing their own versions of the moment when competence is dismissed, or when fraud is attempted, or when assumptions about incompetence create opportunity for exploitation. And the accumulated impact of those choices, the collective resistance to systems that enable exploitation, determines whether conditions improve or whether patterns persist unchanged.